Hello everyone, and welcome back from the break. I'm Helena Pedersen, and it's a great honor for me to share this session with Professor Gary Francione at Rutgers University as keynote presenter, and Professor Ragnhild Solund as commentator. And Ragnhild is from Oslo University. We have this session on Skype, and we are confident it will work. So I will begin with introducing Professor Gary Francione, and then when he has given his paper, I will introduce our commentator, Professor Ragnhild Solund. So, Gary Francione is Board of Governors Professor and Distinguished Professor of Law at Rutgers University. Gary Francione is author of a number of important books and articles on animal rights theory and animals and the law, including Eat Like You Care, an examination of the morality of eating animals, the animal rights debate, abolition or regulation, animals as persons, essays on the abolition of animal exploitation, just to name a few of them. Professor Francione is also a leading figure for the animal rights movement with his critique of animal welfare law and the property status of non-human animals. And he is a groundbreaking scholar who has been teaching animal rights theory and the law for more than 25 years. He has also appeared on numerous radio and television shows. And the title of his presentation is The Failure of the Animal Welfare Approach to Animal Ethics. Please help me welcome Professor Gary Francione.
I'm sorry that I'm having to talk to you by Skype. It was unavoidable. I apologize. I would really rather be there than here right now. Let me also say to you that we have 5 dogs, and at any given time, they could begin to bark, because if they hear a noise or something, we may have, as a matter of fact, hold on 1 minute. I will introduce you to Jamie. Say hello to everybody, Jamie. Okay, this is one of our 5 dogs. But anyway, so at any given time, they could start to bark, so I apologize in advance. I'm not going to read the paper. I'm just going to discuss it with you. I have been at enough conferences in my life. My experience always is when people read papers, particularly longish papers, they tend to put people to sleep, and I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is just, I may refer to it from time to time, but I'm going to just discuss the ideas with you. I think our conventional wisdom, that is what most of us agree is the case in terms of animal ethics, is that we think that animals matter morally. As a matter of fact, I've been doing this work now for almost 30 years. And in the 30 years I've been doing it, I don't think I've ever met anybody who believed or who maintained that animals are completely outside the moral community. Most people maintain that animals have some moral significance, but that they have less moral value than humans do, so that it's all right for humans to use animals, but that we have to observe the rule or the moral norm that we have to impose. We can't impose unnecessary suffering on them. Now, this is a fairly well accepted norm in the sense that we have it in our criminal laws. And you know, what we don't include in the criminal law norms which are controversial, really. I mean, in any sense. I mean, criminal law is supposed to describe the moral norms that we generally agree with. And so, if it's in the criminal law, it's at least supposed to be the case that it reflects our fairly widespread, pervasive moral thinking. And I think it's fair to say that we think it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. We think that that's wrong, and most of us think it's wrong. That's why it's in the criminal law. But most of us also believe that animals have less moral value than humans. Now, I want to challenge that, because I think that I believe a very good argument could be made for animal equality, but not equality in the sense that Peter Singer talks about in terms of saying, well, similar, if animals and humans have similar interests, you have to treat them similarly. I'm not talking about the utilitarian notion of equality. I'm talking about a deontological, rights-oriented notion, which would basically undercut our conventional thinking about animals and require us to really sort of rethink animal ethics, and I believe push us in the direction of abolishing animal use altogether. For me, the issue is not whether or not the exploitation is humane. For me, the issue is whether or not you can justify it. I do not believe you can, and I believe that we are obligated to stop using animals for human purposes. Now, let me say, before I get into the body of the paper, I think it's fair to assume that, let's just look at the idea that most of us accept, that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. I'm so confident that everybody in this room believes that. I'm just wondering, is there anybody in this room that doesn't believe that? Is there anybody who thinks, well, that's not a moral norm that I think has any validity. I think it's perfectly fine to inflict any level of suffering on animals. That the idea that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering, I don't accept it. Does anybody in that room, please put your hand up and show me, because I would like to meet somebody who believes it. I've never met anybody. Everybody believes that. Now, what's really interesting about this is that if you think about that norm for a second, that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering, what does that mean? It means that it can mean a number of things, but it has to have some minimal content, or else it's meaningless, right? Well, the meaning it's got to have, if it's a coherent moral norm at all, is that it is wrong to inflict suffering in situations of, say, pleasure or amusement. In other words, if we say, well, it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, but we can inflict suffering on animals if we get pleasure from it, or if we find it amusing, then we've got a loophole that is so large that the moral norm is meaningless. So I think it would be safe to say that the moral norm, really, if it's coherent, means that in situations in which there is a compulsion or a necessity, we can use animals, but we have to minimize the suffering. But the predicate, or the preliminary idea, is that there's got to be some sort of compulsion. Well, think about it. 99% of the use of our uses of animals can't be justified or described as involving any sort of compulsion. Let's just focus on eating them. Most people eat animal foods. They either eat flesh or dairy or eggs or whatever. Okay, put aside all other uses, because in many ways, all other uses are minor in comparison with the number of animals that we kill for food. Every year on this planet, we kill about 57 billion land animals. A billion is 1,000 million. And we kill about 1 trillion fish. 1 trillion is 1 million million. This is a huge, unbelievably huge number of animals. An unfathomable amount of suffering and death that we are inflicting. Now, it is 2014. Nobody maintains that you need to eat animal products to be optimally healthy. Okay? I have been a vegan for 32 years. I have not had any animal products. And actually, I didn't do it for health reasons. I did not do it for health reasons, but I'm amazed at the energy level I have at my age, and the fact that I have, it's 5:50 in the morning. I've been up since 3:30, and no, I normally don't get up at 3:30 in the morning, but had no problem doing it. Can't remember the last time I had a cold, the idea, I'm not dead yet, so I haven't had any animal products, and I'm not dead. Okay, and so we don't need animal products to be optimally healthy. And animal agriculture is destroying the planet. It's an ecological disaster. The best justification we have, all of us, you, me, everybody, the best justification we have for inflicting suffering and death on 57 billion land animals and 1 trillion sea animals is that they taste good. That's the best justification we have. And I would suggest to you that is not a good justification. It's the same. This is the same sort of, we object to things like bullfighting or dog fighting or clubbing baby seals or whatever it is that, that we do object to. We object to it because we say, well, that's frivolous. I have news for you. Eating animals is no less frivolous than any other frivolous use that we make of animals. I mean, the only use of animals that we make that is not transparently frivolous is the use of animals in research to find cures for serious human illnesses. Now, I don't believe that that's morally justifiable. I think that that's wrong. But that's the only use of animals that we make that isn't transparently frivolous. Everything else has the moral status of dogfighting, bullfighting. We talk about fur. What's the difference between fur and leather and wool and all of these things? The answer is there is no difference. We have an anti-fur campaign because we live in a patriarchal world in which we have misogynistic thinking, and a fur campaign allows us to engage in our sexist patriarchal behavior of going up to women on the street that we don't know and saying nasty things to them. And I've seen lots of animal people over the years do that, and I object to it. There is no difference between fur and leather and wool and silk and all of these other products. And there is no difference. And so all of the frivolous uses of animals that we make, the same thing can be said about eating animals. So I think that even without going further, even without a complicated theory of animal rights, we can exclude 99.99999% of our animal use right from the beginning with nothing more cognitively complicated than the idea that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. Okay, but now let me go to the body of the paper to explore this idea that animals have less moral value than humans. I think that that's wrong. Let's look at the origin of it. Where does this come? Where do these ideas come from? Well, give you a brief history of ideas when it comes to animal ethics. Before the 19th century, and I'm limiting my comments to Western thinking, because in Eastern thinking you have, there's still a huge amount of animal exploitation in places like India, but where you have Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, and those sorts of things, there's different thinking. But with respect to Western thinking, before the 19th century, as a cultural matter, we don't really have a concept of animals as members of the moral or legal community. As a matter of fact, animals are sort of outside the moral and legal community. They are considered to be things, they are considered to be things having no moral value. Now, what was the justification for the idea that animals are things that have no moral value? Well, there were different sorts of rationalizations or justifications. You had people like René Descartes, for example, who believed that animals were not sentient, i.e., they were not subjectively aware, they were not perceptually aware. They did not have interests. They didn't have preferences, desires, or wants. They were machines. He called them automatons. He believed that humans made machines. We made clocks and other sorts of structures, and God made animals, but they were machines that God made. You perhaps heard one of my dogs barking in agreement or objection to Descartes. My dogs do not like Descartes. When we talk about Descartes, they get agitated. They're not happy. So Descartes had this idea that animals did not have interests. So we could not have moral obligations that we owe to them, right? I can't, here is the mouse of my computer, right? I can't have a moral obligation to it. It is a thing. It has no interest. There's nothing I can do that can adversely affect it. I can have moral obligations that concern it. I can have a moral obligation not to throw it at you. Actually, I can't throw it at you because you're a screen. But if I were there physically, I would have a moral obligation not to throw it at you. But that's not an obligation I owe to the mouse. It's an obligation that I owe to you. And so if Descartes was right, if animals were not sentient, if they had no ability to feel pain, if they weren't conscious at all, if they had no interests, we could have no moral or legal obligations to them because nothing we do could adversely affect them. Okay? Now, I think Descartes was unique in the history of philosophy in that I think it's very difficult. I'm not even sure Descartes believed that, actually, because there are parts of Descartes where he seems to not believe what he says about animals not being conscious. He seems to be critical of his own ideas. So it's not really clear to me whether Descartes believed that or not. But if he did, he is unique in the history of philosophy because, for the most part, most other thinkers up to the 19th century who excluded animals from the moral community basically believed that they were inferiors. They had interests, but we could ignore those interests because we could treat them as if they were Cartesian machines. Because they were lesser beings than us. Why is that? Well, you had different people saying different things. You had people like Aquinas, for example, who said, well, they don't have souls. And you had people like Kant, who said, well, they're not able to reciprocate morally. You had people like John Locke, who said, well, they're rational, but they're not able to use abstract thinking. So, they're cognitively inferior. That is, their minds are inferior to ours. They're not rational. They can't use abstract thoughts. They don't use symbolic communication, or they're spiritually inferior to us. God made us in God's image, and God did not, God made animals for humans, etc. All the spiritual say, animals don't have souls, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So that they're inferior, and we can treat them as if they are Cartesian machines. This is basically the thinking that we go into the 19th century with, by and large. I mean, with very few exceptions, there were obviously people along the way who disagreed with this. But as far as the culture is concerned, as far as the law is concerned, that was the thinking. The thinking was animals were outside the moral community altogether. Okay? All right. Now, by the way, are you all able to hear me okay? I mean, is this coming out? Okay, great. Technology, when it works, is great. So, okay, when it doesn't work, it's not great. All right, so now, in the 19th century, this shifts dramatically. And interestingly, in the history of ideas, I think there are very few instances where you see such a radical shift in such a fairly short period of time. In the 19th century, starting in Britain, where you've got people who are opposed to race-based slavery, who are thinking about women being able to vote, who are concerned about child welfare issues, etc. These people start turning their attention to animals. Now, there were a number of them. We tend to think of Jeremy Bentham as sort of the prominent figure, but there were other people. There was John Stuart Mill, there was Humphrey Fremont, there were many other people. And interestingly, although Bentham is the person that we most credit these ideas with in terms of Western thinking, it's basically, most of what Bentham said that we focus on was contained in a footnote to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. So it just goes to show you, the next time you denigrate scholarship because it's got too many footnotes, you never know when one of those footnotes is going to change the world. Okay, so Bentham comes along and he says, well, wait a minute now. He said, look, animals, they may not be able to think or reason the way we do, but they can suffer. And we have a moral obligation that we owe directly to them. It's not an obligation that we owe to other humans that we satisfy indirectly through animals, but it's an obligation that we owe directly to animals. Okay? To take their interests into consideration and not discount them simply because of their species. He talks in that footnote about how, we've got slavery. And the only difference between the slaves and the non-slaves is race, and that's not right. And we can't ignore the interests of animals simply because of species. We can't do that. Okay? And so he says the issue is not can they reason, can they speak? The issue is can they suffer? And what's really interesting is this idea takes hold in a way that is really quite remarkable in terms of the history of ideas. It spreads very, very rapidly. It's accepted culturally. It's accepted very readily in British culture. Okay, it results in laws coming into effect in the 19th century. By the time you get into the 20th century, there are anti-cruelty laws all over the place. I mean, Britain's got them, we've got them, every state has them, you have them, everybody's got them by the 20th century, basically. That's a fairly short period of time for a paradigm to shift in that way. Now, what's interesting is, let's go back to the 19th century. Bentham comes up with these ideas. Does he advocate the abolition of animal use? Does he say, we've got to stop it? Bentham was opposed to slavery. And what's interesting, people, is that Bentham was a utilitarian. But yet he believed in the moral right not to be slaves. And interestingly, if you read Bentham, the only time he talks about moral right, because he was a utilitarian. Utilitarians don't believe in moral rights. The only time he talked about moral rights was he talked about the moral right not to be a slave. Okay? Because Bentham understood, I believe, he never said this, but I believe the only way you can read Bentham and make sense of it is to say that Bentham understood that if you're a slave, your interests will never receive equal consideration because your interests will always be devalued relative to the slave owner. So you're always, in any conflict situation, you've got the slave owner, you've got the slave. The slave's interests are always going to be accorded less protection. Okay? So I think Bentham understood that the institution of slavery was structurally immoral because it simply could not satisfy the principle of equal consideration. So that there had to be a moral right not to be a slave, or else you were outside the moral community. Now, Bentham never said that. He never said it that way. But nevertheless, I believe that is the only way you can understand what Bentham was saying when he talked about the moral right not to be a slave. Is that he understood there was something structurally defective about slavery. Did Bentham think that did he advocate the abolition of animal slavery, of animal use? The answer is no, he didn't. Well, why not? Well, I mean, the simple answer to the question is Bentham wanted to continue to eat them. Which look, the desire to eat animal products has clouded some of the most brilliant minds in human history. It really has. I mean, it really absolutely has. But the easy answer is Bentham wanted to continue to eat animals. All right, but he came up with a rational justification. He said, well, it was all right for us to use them. And he said, because he said, even though they can suffer, they're not aware, and their mind, they can't think, they can't reason. That is not relevant to the morality of their suffering, but it's relevant to the morality of their use because they're not self-aware. And they don't have, they don't care that we use them. They only care about how we use them. The cow doesn't care that we kill and eat her. She only cares about how we treat her and how we slaughter her. Bentham believed animals were not self-aware. Okay? You also have people like Mill, John Stuart Mill, who believe that, that animal interests always, that he believed that animal interests had moral value, but he also believed that because we were cognitively more sophisticated, our interests would be more meaningful. So that Mill said animals lack a sense of dignity, which all human beings possess in one form or another. Humans have a more developed intelligence, which gives a wider range to the whole of their sentiments, whether self-regarding or sympathetic. It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Okay, that's the extent of my reading my paper. Okay, so and so they did not advocate the abolition of animal use because they believed that animals didn't have an interest in not being used. So unlike slaves who have an interest in not being slaves, animals don't really care that we use them. They only care about how we use them. Okay, now. This idea persists to this day. As a matter of fact, this is really basically Peter Singer's view. I mean, Peter Singer has developed it to some degree, and he's made it more nuanced and whatnot. But the bottom line is, Bentham's position is really no different, or Singer's position is really no different from Bentham's position. Singer takes the position that, there are some animals who have an interest in their life, like the non-human great apes and dolphins and elephants and whatnot. But that for the most part, the animals that we exploit routinely every day, the chickens, the pigs, the cows, the fish, they're sentient, but they don't have self-awareness. They are not, they have no sense of their own lives. So Singer's position is, killing them is not per se to harm them. If you kill them painfully, then, if you cause them suffering or you cause them distress, then that matters that matters morally. But if you kill them painlessly, for example, you're not really harming them because you're not taking anything from them they don't know what you're taking from them because they have no sense of their lives. Now, Singer's now in Singer's most recent Practical Ethics edition of Practical Ethics, he says, well, maybe there's some empirical evidence that some of these other animals are self-aware, but it depends on how much weight you give to the evidence, and he's still not willing to say that we ought to be thinking about chickens the same way we think about non-human great apes. So, but basically, and Singer still continues to promote happy exploitation. As a matter of fact, Singer is the leader of the worldwide happy exploitation movement, that we need to start modify or modifying the sort of worst abuses of factory farming, but that it's otherwise it's morally defensible to be a conscientious omnivore, somebody who's really conscientious to eat animals who have been raised well, slaughtered happily, etc., etc. That's still Singer's view, but in many ways Singer's view is no different from Bentham's views in the 19th century. So you could say, well, Jeremy Bentham had this crazy idea that animals were not aware and didn't really care that we used them. And how could he possibly have thought that? But the reality is that's exactly what Singer thinks. Okay. And I would suggest to you that is, I was recently being interviewed on a radio show, and they were talking about PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And they were talking about the fact that PETA kills. They have a shelter at their facility, and they take in all these animals and they kill them. And they kill like 95% of the animals they take in. And this person asked me, how can that, can that be possible? How could that possibly happen? And I said, I understand it completely. They basically bought into Singer's view that killing an animal, if you take a dog or a cat and you kill the animal painlessly, you haven't harmed the animal. And so, this idea, this way of thinking is pervasive across the world, basically. I do not know of any large animal organization anywhere in North America, in Europe, or any place else, any large group that takes the position that we have to abolish animal use. They're basically all taking the position that the moral imperative is to make exploitation happen. To increase the welfare of animals that we exploit. Okay? So not only so as crazy as Bentham's idea may sound that we're not harming an animal when we kill the animal, then it may sound crazy ostensibly, but it's an idea that is accepted fairly. It's a fairly ubiquitously shared idea, and it's wrong when you think about it. Let's explore it for a second. Now, obviously, there's a difference. It's better if let's say I decided to kill you. Well, is it better if I sneak into your room while you are sleeping and I put a bullet into your head, which if I have the gun pointed well or correctly, you won't feel anything. I will kill you without any pain. Is that better than torturing you to death? And the answer is, well, yes, it's better than torturing, but I still harmed you by killing you. Okay, so I think we've got obviously less suffering is better than more suffering, but that doesn't answer the question about the morality of the use to begin with. Now, my view is that this idea that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live, that they don't have an interest in their lives, that they're not self-aware, is just crazy. And and it really, if we take a step back, we should see this, fairly clearly. Let me give you an example involving humans. It's the view of people like Bentham and Singer that animals live in an eternal present. That they don't really have a concept of the future. They don't have memories of the past. They just live in this constant present. Now, I don't think that that's true. I live with 5 dogs. I do not. I watch their behavior. I'm very interested in their behavior. I love watching them. I love watching how they interact with each other, with me, with other animals. And it's clear to me that they have a very highly developed sense, a very sophisticated sense of self-awareness. But let's assume for a second that they didn't. Let's assume that they were constantly stuck in this present moment, which is the way Bentham thought, animals were, the way Singer thinks animals are. Let's assume that animals are stuck in the eternal present.
does that mean it's okay? Does that mean that they're not self-aware? And the answer is no, of course it doesn't mean that. There's a phenomenon called transient global amnesia, where some human beings suffer from this phenomenon, from this illness, where they have no sense of the past, they have no sense of the present, or of the future. I've talked with these people. I've met people who have this condition, and it's very interesting. They don't remember what they did 5 minutes ago, and they're not able to think about what they're going to do 5 minutes in the future. But they have a very strong sense of themselves right now, in the present. So the fact that, now, is there having transient global amnesia, is that morally relevant? It may be for some purposes. If Lund University is thinking of hiring a history professor, and the question is, are we going to hire somebody who's got transient global amnesia or somebody who doesn't have transient global amnesia, then the fact that you've got that condition may be morally relevant because you aren't going to be a very good history teacher. But if the question is who do we use as a forced organ donor or as a non-consenting subject in biomedical experiments or something like that, if the question is who do we use, the normal person or the person with transient global amnesia, the answer is we don't use either of them. They are both self-aware. They both have an interest in their continued existence, even though it may be different. So what? If you can't say that a being that is stuck in an eternal present isn't self-aware, it just means their self-awareness is different. I mean, I have no doubt that the self-awareness of my dogs is different from my self-awareness. I use symbolic communication, they don't. But I also have no doubt that they're self-aware. I mean, think about it for a second. Sentience, perceptual awareness, subjective awareness is not something which has evolved as it doesn't evolve in a vacuum. It's something which beings who are sentient use to protect themselves. I mean, when I feel pain, I move away from it because it is dangerous to my existence. Okay? So sentience is a means to the end of continued survival. So to say that a being is sentient but does not have an interest in continuing to live is like saying you have eyes, but you don't have an interest in continuing to see. That analogy is really, I mean, there are problems with all analogies, but I think that analogy works quite well. To say that you have eyes, but you don't have any, I mean, if I were to say that you don't have an interest in seeing, you have eyes, but you don't have an interest in seeing, you would think, boy, he's a peculiar guy. I mean, he's an American and all that, but even for an American, he's a peculiar guy. But to say that somebody is sentient and doesn't have an interest in continuing to live, I find as peculiar as saying you've got eyes, but you don't have an interest in continuing to see. So, I mean, look, cognitive abilities can be morally relevant. I mean, if you've got somebody who's severely mentally disabled and somebody who is not, you might say, well, somebody who's severely mentally disabled depends on the question you're asking. If you say, well, is the mental disability, the lack of cognitive sophistication, is it morally relevant? The answer is it may be. I mean, if you're really mentally disabled, severely mentally disabled, we may not let you have a driver's license. We may not let you have credit cards. We may require a court appoint a guardian to protect you, or to make contracts for you because you can't do them yourself. I mean, yes, if you have certain disabilities, those disabilities may be morally relevant. But if the question is, who do we use as a forced organ donor? Who do we enslave? Who do we use in a painful biomedical experiment? The person who's got normal cognitive abilities or the person who doesn't, the answer is you don't use either of them. Because once you say it's all right to enslave people or to use them as forced organ donors or to use them as non-consenting subjects in biomedical experiments, you've basically removed them from the moral community. You've made it impossible to give their interests equal consideration. You're doing exactly what Bentham recognized was the problem with slavery, was that you were taking beings outside the moral community by making it structurally impossible to accord their interests equal consideration. And that's exactly what we do. And that's why I argue that all sentient beings, if they are to be members of the moral community, must be protected by a right not to be property. Because property is that which has only external or extrinsic value, has no intrinsic or inherent value, and basically exists outside the moral community. To be property is to be a thing. Okay, to be a member of the moral community is to have moral value. Okay, requires that we have at least, we may need other rights, but we need at least one right, and that is the right not to be treated as property. But once we recognize that right, the world changes. You can't eat them anymore. You can't wear them anymore. We can't use them in biomedical experiments anymore. We've got to stop exploiting them altogether. So yeah, it's one right. Okay? But it's one right which, if we recognize it, we basically change in a fairly dramatic way how we think about animals. So, look, what I want us to take away from this is we have this idea. We have this idea that animals are not equal to us. I don't even know in many ways what that means. Animals are, it's for purposes of being used as a resource, all sentient beings are equal. Every sentient being, human or not, has an interest in not being treated exclusively as a resource. Okay? And the only way we can protect that is using a right. All a right is a way of protecting an interest, and says that you have to protect the interest irrespective of consequential considerations, basically. That's all a right is a way of protecting an interest. So if animals are to be members of the moral community, we must accord them this one right. But once we do, we have to stop exploiting them. We can no longer have any institutionalized use of animals anymore. We can't justify it. And so, I think, it's so interesting to me. I'm not going to ask you how many of you are vegans, because there may be nobody who's a vegan. I don't know. But what I want you to think about, though, tonight is, or this afternoon, whenever you're eating the next time, I want you to think about something. Do you think animals matter morally? Are they things, or do they have moral value? And if you believe that they have moral value, then you must believe that it would be wrong to inflict suffering or death on them gratuitously for no reason whatsoever. You might believe that if you're on a desert island and there are no vegetables around, and it's a question of whether you eat a rabbit or whether you die, that it's okay for you to eat the rabbit. But truth be told, if you were on a desert island with your best friend, your best human friend, and there were no vegetables or no animals to eat, you might consider eating your best friend, because that's what happens when people are on desert islands and they're starving to death. Actually, there have been legal cases where people have killed each other and eaten each other in those sorts of situations, and in which courts have been somewhat lenient about that, because we recognize that when people are on lifeboats or on desert islands and things like that, they are in situations of compulsion, which morally mitigates their moral decisions. But when you are thinking about, when you are deciding what you're going to eat for lunch today, you're not on a desert island. You're in Sweden. Perfectly. You've got all sorts of options available. You're not on a desert island. There's no conflict between you and the cow. There's no conflict between you and the pig. The only thing that's going on there is what your palate, what your taste says, what your taste says gives you pleasure. And how is that any different from the things we all condemn? There's a guy here in the United States. I don't know if you've heard about him. His name is Michael Vick, and he's a football player. And in the United States, sports is a ridiculous obsession. And we obsess about sports figures. And Michael Vick was arrested in 2007 for dogfighting. He had some land in Virginia, and he was arrested because he was conducting dogfighting. He went to jail for this. He went to jail. There was tax evasion issues and other things like that. But he basically went to jail. People in the United States hate Michael Vick. Whenever Michael Vick's name, I mean, the guy's come out of jail now. He's continuing to play football. Wherever he shows up for a public event, there are people demonstrating. People hate Michael Vick. The amount of vitriol of hatred that is directed at Michael Vick because he engaged in dogfighting is just really phenomenal. And, I give lectures about, these topics. And one of the things I talk about, particularly when I'm in the United States, is Michael Vick, because I start off and I say, how many people in this audience have heard of Michael Vick? And everybody raises his or her hand and says, yes, of course I've heard about Michael Vick. And then I say, Michael Vick, bad guy, isn't he? Oh, yeah, he's a bad guy. Why is he a bad guy? Well, because Michael Vick engaged in inflicting suffering and death on animals, and he had no good reason to do it. He just did it because he enjoyed, he enjoyed watching dogs fight. He got pleasure from it. He found it amusing. And everybody thinks that's wrong. So I can be giving a lecture to 300 people, and I say, why is what he did wrong? And, we'll talk about it for a few minutes, and what will emerge from that group is people will say he was wrong because he inflicted suffering and death, and he had no good reason. It was simply a matter of pleasure and amusement. Okay? And then I follow up and I say, so we all agree that's wrong. Everybody will shake their head. 300 people will shake their heads. Yes, it's wrong. And then I say, okay, fine. How many of y'all are vegans? And like 6 hands go up out of 300 people. And I say, okay, fine. You need to explain that to me because it doesn't make any sense to me. How is what we're doing any different from what Michael Vick is doing? Because he inflicts suffering and death because he gets pleasure and amusement. We inflict suffering and death because we enjoy the taste. And one of the other subjects I teach is criminal law. I teach criminal law to first-year law students. And one of the first things they learn is it doesn't really matter whether I kill you directly or whether I pay somebody else to kill you. It's still murder, and it's still punished at the same level. And it doesn't really matter whether you kill the animal you eat or whether you pay someone else to kill the animal you eat. There's no moral distinction. There may be a psychological distinction. There's no moral distinction. So it may be psychologically relevant to people like sitting around watching dogs fight, that they find that amusing on some level. That may say something about the person's psychology. It may tell you about, what sort of person that is as a psychological matter. It's no different from you're going to the store and buying the dead animal or buying the dairy or the eggs. And I want to make there's a lot of people make this distinction between flesh and dairy and egg. There is no morally coherent distinction. The animals used for dairy, for example, are generally kept alive longer. They're treated every bit as badly as the animals used for meat. They end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. Eggs, horrible. And there's no such thing as humane exploitation. So don't kid yourself thinking, the EU's got laws that say that they can't be in, the hens can't be in conventional cages. Well, first of all, most of the EU doesn't comply with the battery cage directive. And even if they did, you would still have, what the EU requires is enriched cages. To me, that's like saying, well, what's the difference? Is there a moral distinction between waterboarding somebody on a bare waterboard or waterboarding them on a padded waterboard? Well, I guess there's a difference of a pad, but does it make the torture of waterboarding any better? And the answer is no, it does not. So I think we really need to rethink animal ethics right from the beginning, and I think we've got to put aside all of this nonsense that animals are not self-aware. That is a fantasy we have told ourselves, so we can continue to consume them. But it is no more than a fantasy. And so the bottom line is if we think that, what Michael Vick did when he was, dogfighting or all these campaigns against bullfighting, if we think that stuff is bad, then we are morally obligated to follow through with what we believe, because the reality is if we're not vegans, we're no better or no different from Michael Vick. We're no different from the bullfighters. We're no different from the people who are doing the things that we all agree are morally unjustifiable because there's no compulsion. There is no compulsion. When you decide what you're going to eat this afternoon or this evening, there is no compulsion. It's simply a matter of your desires. You need to decide if animals matter, then abolishing animal use is the only rational response to the recognition that animals matter. And there I have finished, and I wait for my commentator to tell me why I'm wrong. on.
And now come to the questions to Francione now. Yeah, they could have spokesperson like humans who in lack of cognitive capacities as spokespersons, and consequently also protection in human rights and therefore in law. An argument against the comparison between human rights and animal rights is that the Human Rights Convention failed. It fails in protecting humans, like the Child Convention fails in protecting children. So could we expect a hypothetical animal rights convention, for example, to actually give animals more rights? So in my consequence, my question would be, how can animals be protected through rights, Francione? And I have a bit more, and that is more concretely regarding the happy exploitation movement. The welfare paradigm is so attractive to many because it allows consumers to claim that they do care about animals while continuing to exploit them. The animal rights position is a harder one to sell to larger audiences. Most consumers do not read philosophical or legal arguments, and the question is how convince the masses to abstain from the good they find meat eating and animal exploitation practices with broad cultural and traditional accept, when they would think they get nothing in return. Humans are selfish. Meat consumption and other animal exploitation, for example in regards to pharmaceutical experiments, have strong political support and strong corporate interest in continued exploitation. So I would like you to comment on that. And then finally, in regards to the social and physical distance which exists between people and the animals they consume, and to their denial of what is actually going on, animals are not victims, etc. I don't want to see what's going on. Stan Cohen wrote about this, not in regards to animals. Consumers do not want to know the implications of their practices. They want to protect themselves from a reality they find disturbing. How would you suggest to proceed in order to alter the habits and practices of those who disagree with you? Thank you.
Should I go ahead and answer those questions now?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you said a number of interesting things. Let me just address a couple of them. With respect to your questions, would I expect an animal rights convention? I do not believe that the law is going to. I don't think you can legislate this. I think this requires a moral shift, a paradigm shift. And before we say, well, that's impossible, I would suggest let's go back historically to, the 19th century and recognize that when we enter the 19th century, basically animals are excluded from the moral community. When we leave the 19th century, we have a completely different way of thinking about these issues. Now, I don't think that it's been a successful way of thinking about the issues, but you see in a fairly short period of time, there is a paradigm shift. Now, I think, are there people in the world who don't care about animals? And the answer is, yeah, there's lots of them. But there's also an awful lot of them who do care about animals and who are concerned about these issues. And I think that what we've done is we have convinced those people that, or we've made people feel comfortable about exploitation because what we've said is, well, look, you're concerned about animals, but the response you need to have is you need to go and buy humanely raised meat or humanely produced milk or that sort of thing. We are not. It's very look. The animal groups themselves, all of these large animal groups, none of them talks about veganism as a moral imperative. They talk about, they'll say good things about veganism. They'll say, well, if you really care about animals and you want to take that really hard step to be a vegan, well, then that's great, but you can do a lot, you can satisfy your moral obligations by doing a lot less, by going and buying cage-free eggs or buying, humanely raised meat or organic milk or any of that nonsense. So what we have told all of these people, there are a lot of people out there who really do care. And what we've told them is you can satisfy your moral obligations by doing virtually nothing, by paying a little bit more to buy animals who are tortured a tiny bit less, if that. Okay? And so that's what we've told them. So, it's no surprise to me
then that's what people are responding to. Now, I have a Facebook page. I had to be dragged doing this by my students because I really don't like these things. But I did this Facebook page, and it's not a personal page. It's my public profile page. The abolitionist approach to animal rights. I have almost 58,000 people, and I've only been doing it for a fairly short period of time. And the number of people I have writing to me who say to me, I've been a vegetarian for 20 years. It's never occurred to me that I should be a vegan. No one's ever told me. I'm a member of this group. I'm a member of that group. No one's ever told me. No one's ever talked about this idea that veganism is a moral imperative. And there are only two philosophers, myself and Gary Steiner from Bucknell University, who talk about veganism as a moral imperative. Basically, Reagan does to some degree, but even Reagan has this idea that that animals have more opportunities for satisfaction than humans do, and therefore, Tom buys into this idea to some degree that animals have a lesser moral value. Their lives have a lesser moral value than humans do, although he does talk about veganism. But the people who have really sort of promoted veganism as a moral imperative have been me and Gary Steiner, which is really pathetic when you think about it, that there are like two people out there two theorists out there who are talking about veganism as a moral imperative, and none of these organizations are doing that. So I run into people all the time who say, I'm a member of this organization, I'm a member of that organization. I really care about animals. I say, are you vegan? No, but I buy cage-free eggs. Well, but that's the problem. The problem is we're not being clear. So I think we need to be clear. I agree with the observation that there's a cultural problem because people like to consume animal products. They look for excuses to consume animal products. But what we're doing is giving them those excuses. So I think what we need to do is to be really clear. I think we need to be really, really clear that if we regard animals as having any moral value whatsoever, you don't even have to get into the fine points of philosophy. If you regard animals as being morally relevant and their lives as having some moral relevance, you can't eat them anymore. You can't wear them anymore. You can't consume them anymore in the ways that we routinely consume them. You just can't do it. That there's no rational way you can explain them. And so I think we just need to be clear with people. Now, do I think that, a lot of people will respond positively to that? All I can tell you is I'm a tenured professor. If I never do anything for the remainder of my life, I will have a job because the way we do things in universities in the United States, and I suspect, I don't know whether it's the same in Sweden, but if you're a tenured professor, you basically can become about as active as a rock is, and you'll always have your job because you have this thing called tenure. So if I never do anything for the remainder of my life, I will still have my job. Why do I do this every day? Why do I get up at 5:30 in the morning, or actually earlier, to do these sorts of things? Because I do this quite a bit. I do it because I get a tremendous response from people. I'll give a lecture, and I will get emails coming in from people over the course of 6-7 months after I give the lecture saying, I've gone vegan now. I never heard it explained that way before. I do care about animals. I do love animals. I do recognize that now that you've said to me, loving animals is inconsistent with harming animals. And now that you've explained that veganism, you describe veganism in a way that doesn't make it look extreme. Look, we tend to think that veganism is an extreme thing. It's not extreme. What's extreme is teaching our children to love animals and then that we can harm that which we love. I think that's really sick. I think that's really extreme. Saying to children, you love animals, you don't eat them, you don't harm them, you don't wear them. That's not extreme at all. As a matter of fact, that's quite consistent with what we're teaching our children. So I think, we've got to get away from this idea that veganism is an extreme. It's not extreme at all. What's extreme is our hypocrisy. What's extreme is our moral schizophrenia. The fact that we claim animals matter, but then we act in ways which completely rejects that idea. The other idea about, so I don't think the law is going to work in this. Law is not progressive. As Marx correctly pointed out, that law is part of, the superstructure. And that, law follows morality in many ways. It doesn't lead morality. So, What we need is a paradigm shift in morality. But I honestly believe we can do that. And the reason I believe we can do that is the response that I'm getting, the fact that I'm one person. I don't have an organization. I don't have any employees. I'm one person. I do this stuff all the time, and the reaction I'm getting from people is just phenomenal. So obviously, this is a message which resonates with people. And so I think, I wonder, I always think, what could we do if we took all of these young people and all of these animal organizations and all that money and all that labor and all that energy, and we put it into creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy instead of promoting cage-free eggs, happy meat, happy milk, and all that sort of stuff? What could we do? My view is we could change the world in a fairly short period of time. So, by the way, is the connection okay? I'm getting some weird messages. The connection okay? Okay. And so I think we could do that. And the law, the law will follow later on. We need to shift the moral paradigm. And we shift the moral paradigm by getting people to rethink ethical issues. One comment I wanted to make about laws as a general matter. Because animals are property, they only have an economic significance in terms of the law. The reality is, animal welfare law, whether it's in the United States, Sweden, or on the moon, basically animal welfare law is basically concerned with what I call efficient exploitation. Generally, we protect animal interests when we get a benefit from doing so. And so what animal welfare laws basically do is ensure that we exploit animals in economically efficient ways. For example, why do we have laws that require that animals be rendered unconscious before they're shackled, hoisted, and killed? And the answer is because when you have a 2,000-pound animal hanging upside down and she's conscious, she moves around a lot, and she hits workers and causes injuries, and she incurs carcass damage, which makes her meat economically less valuable. So we tend to have animal welfare laws which protect our economic interests, okay? So I think we've got to, animal welfare laws really are not about animals. They're about the protection of property. And some of the examples that were given before about these endangered species laws, I mean, look, again, that shows how humanocentric, how anthropocentric these things are. We protect species so that we can have enough of them so that we can go kill them later on. We get concerned when their numbers dwindle so that we then protect them, so that we inflate their populations so that we can then go kill them. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. But the bottom line is, approaching this from the standpoint of law is the wrong way to do it, because looking at these other issues, endangered species, cruelty. I mean, what is animal cruelty? I mean, we criminalize things that are no different from what we all engage in. So, we put people in jail, we prosecute people for injuring a dog, but we will, because we fetishize dogs in Western civilization. But we who are not vegans are participating in conduct that is every bit as bad, if not worse, than what was done to the dog. It's completely irrational. The bottom line is nothing changes until we stop eating them. Once we stop eating them, everything changes. And so, I will have these bizarre experiences. I'll go to conferences and, I'm talking with a group of intellectuals about animal ethics. And then we'll go for dinner, and the people that I'm on the panel with or the people I'm at the conference with are sitting there eating steak. And they say, well, I'm really having a hard time understanding your position, Francione. And I said, well, obviously you are. I mean, you want to continue. The only way you can continue to eat that meat or drink that milk or eat that ice cream is by having a problem with what I'm saying. So we really got to sort of get to the moral issue. The law is not going to handle this. I'm sorry for that long-winded answer. Sorry.
We would like to sort of look in the audience a few questions if there are any. I'm sure there are. Okay, so Kurt, please.
Well, yeah, it's a little bit choppy, but try it.
Try to speak clearly. I know you didn't want to bring law into this because you're quite critical of it, but I wanted to get your opinion on whether or not, when we do accept that animals have a self-awareness and interest, how much that interest then extends. I won't say fiduciary responsibility, but how much of that interest extends to us having a particular relationship with them. Not really thinking dogs or cats or kind of crows or raccoons, where their lives and interests depend on feeding off our society's waste. And then I was also, to just add on to that, interested in hearing your thoughts on Kimlicka and Donaldson's model of liberal citizenship, which kind of applies to this question.
Well, that's a good question. Rutgers in April, we had a conference, and Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson came, who wrote Zoopolis. They came, and Gary Steiner was there, and David Nybert, and Sherry Kolb, Michael Dorf. It was a very interesting. It was a one-day conference, and we had this interesting discussion about, the Donaldson-Kimlicka argument about citizenship. And look. Their argument is, or their position is, well, what do we do after we've abolished all animal exploitation? How do we relate to animals? And I guess my answer to that is, let's worry about abolishing animal use first, and then we'll worry about the finer points. Because Will and Sue seem to think that people will not embrace abolition because it's too negative. They need something positive to hold on to. And the answer is, yeah, but if what the positive thing they're holding on to requires that we abolish exploitation, which Sue and Will maintain that we need to do anyway, the idea that we need to figure out what to do afterward, is great, but let's worry now about the fact that we live in a world of unfathomable violence and exploitation of animals. The question that always comes up to me is, well, you have 5 dogs, and the answer is, yeah, I have 5 dogs, and I've had up to 7 at one point, and I love my dogs. But you will not find anybody on the planet Earth who loves interacting and having dogs and living with dogs as much as I do. But if there were 2 dogs left on the planet, and it were up to me as to whether or not they continue to breed so that we could have pets, the answer is not on your life. I do not believe in, I love my dogs, but they are my property as far as the law is concerned. I could put them in a car today, take them to a veterinarian and have them killed. I could drop them at a kill shelter, or I could kill them myself, as long as I do so, quote, humanely. They are my property. I love them, but they are my property, and I can value their interests at 0. I think that's a horrible situation. I'm glad that my dogs are with me, but there are a lot of dogs who are not with people who love them as much as I love my dogs, and respect and care for my dogs. And so this idea, I think domestication is terrible. My dogs are totally dependent on me for when they eat, when they drink, when they go out. Everything about their lives is controlled by me. I don't like that. They are refugees. I have an obligation to, I have an obligation to care for them, and I think we all do. They're domesticated animals are in this mess because of us. So we have an obligation to care for them, but we also have an obligation to stop bringing them into existence. And I know that a lot of people find that really problematic, and they say, well, but I can't imagine a world without dogs. And the answer is, look, I can't imagine if we lived in a world in which we weren't eating them anymore. I wouldn't even, that world would be a very different world from the world that we live in. It would be a much less violent world. I really believe that. I really believe that much of our violence against other humans is linked very, very much with our violence against animals. One of the things I do is I teach a class with Anna Charlton at the university called Human Rights and Animal Rights, and we talk about racism, sexism, heterosexism, speciesism, because I think these things are all related. I think this otherization is common. The otherization is common in all forms of discrimination, including speciesism, and I think that we need to see the relationship between human rights and animal rights, and the fact that our violence against animals facilitates our violence against humans, and it makes perfect sense that it would. If you look at the history of human discrimination, whether against people of color or women or gay people, we animalize them. What we do is we reduce them to the animal, and then we justify their exploitation. And so, but if we weren't otherizing the animals, we would find it so much more difficult, if not impossible, to otherize humans. And so I believe that this is an extremely important thing, not only because I believe it's a matter of justice for non-humans, but also because I believe that we're deluding ourselves if we think that we are going to, that we're going to achieve some acceptable level
of human rights without re-examining our violence, toward non-human animals.
Susan.
I'm concerned with the idea that veganism is the solution to the problem that you've identified here, in part because it seems to me like you're repeating exactly what you're trying to avoid doing in this putting a happy face on exploitation, in part because I can't get around the notion that even veganism on a massive, reliant on a massive scale of agriculture involves a lot of animal suffering, but it's not the blood that we see on our plates. It's the blood of animals like rats and others who are treated as collateral damage, I guess, to any agricultural industry whatsoever. And I wonder what you have to say about that, because obviously you've thought a lot about these things.
Can I just
Okay.
ask you
Thank you.
to respond quite briefly, because you have a few more questions to ask before. So, possibility.
Should I answer? I'm having a hard time hearing. Should I answer that?
Yes, please, briefly,
Oh,
if you can, because we want to get in a few more questions.
Yeah. That's a good question. Let me just say this. I believe, along with the Jains and the Buddhists, that you can't live in the material world without harming. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, that's the Sramanic tradition, is that living in the world and living in the material world necessarily causes harm to other beings. Having said that, if we were all vegans, the amount of land under cultivation, I mean, think about it, using between 6 and 12 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh. If all of the world were vegans, if we were all vegans, we would actually have many fewer animals, many fewer acres under cultivation. So the collateral damage animals would be many, many, many billions fewer, first of all. Secondly, if we were all vegans, we would be figuring out ways of doing plant agriculture that was less harmful, because we would be concerned about those issues. So when you say, well, is veganism the answer? The answer is, well, no, it's not the complete answer, because nothing is the complete answer. There will always be, as long as we are, look, all of us are responsible to the extent that we consume things. The things that we consume, even if they're good, even if they're free trade items and things like that, those things involve production processes in which some humans are injured and killed. So there is no way that we can avoid living in the material world without engaging in behavior which has at least indirect harm, indirectly causes harm to other humans and to non-humans. But we can sort of change the way we think about these issues. And if we were all vegans, the amount of collateral damage would be much, much, much less, and we would be thinking about how to reduce that even further. So it's not a perfect solution, but then again, nothing is a perfect solution to living in the material world, which is why Buddhists and Jains, try to meditate their way out of coming back again.
Kari.
Question concerning children. You said that the message is very compatible with what's taught to children anyway about kindness. I thought you had any sort of practical ideas how to get across with this message in school, because there's lots of obstacles, and also if school is really compatible with the children's rights, or I don't know. I was thinking children as property. What do you think about school and the possibilities to get across in school?
Children are property. Children are property. They're not chattel property. You can't sell your children. You're not supposed to be able to. I think that there are all sorts of issues that are raised about how we treat children and whatnot. How do we get this into schools? Well, that's a problem, because I can go to any university and I can talk in all sorts of but I very rarely. I don't think I've ever been invited. I've been invited to a few high schools. I've never been invited to a grammar school, because the idea that I'm going to tell children that drinking milk is immoral is it freaks a lot of people out. So I don't get invited to grammar schools. And as I say, in my entire life, I think I've been invited to like 3 high schools. Where the students are range in age from 14 to 18. Universities and colleges, yes, I speak at them all the time. But how do we get this into school? Well, that's a problem because the schools are they promote animal exploitation, and parents don't want their children exposed to these ideas because children are very receptive. I mean, I have to tell you something. I may not get exposed. I may not be invited to grammar schools, but I talk to every little kid I can because they're actually the best. They're the best people to talk to because get them young before they get terribly confused by civilization, and you've got a much better chance. And so I think everybody recognizes that, but I agree with you. The key to changing this is educating our children. But in order to educate our children, fortunately or unfortunately, whatever we need to get the adults. You need to get the teachers on board before they're going to let you into the schools to talk to the kids. Once we start moving this, and I believe honestly we can. There's some interesting research that's been done about shifting moral views, and now there's only one study came out of Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute, which is a good school, and the study is an interesting study. And the researchers concluded that if 10% of a population believes in something in a really strong way, morally, it can have the effect of disseminating that idea throughout the culture. And now, my view is if we could get 10% of the population of any place that was firmly committed to the idea of veganism as a moral imperative, not the idea that we have to treat animals well, because everybody agrees with that, but it doesn't mean anything. But that if we got 10% of the population on board with the idea that veganism is a moral imperative, it would start a different conversation. And that conversation would have dramatic effects in the society because right now, as a cultural matter, all we do is talk about treatment issues. Our discussion about animal ethics is focused almost 100% on cage-free eggs, humane meat, dealing with issues of factory farming, all that sort of stuff. We don't talk about use. We don't talk about whether or not it's all right to kill them, however well we treat them. That the issue of killing them when we don't have to raises an extremely important moral issue that we need to confront. If we were having that discussion, you'd see changes happening. I really believe this. I wouldn't do this. As I say, I don't get paid to do this. I wouldn't do this if I didn't believe that that this will resonate with people, and I see it happen every single day of my life. I wish I share sometimes the emails I get when people give me permission to do it, but I get them from all over the world. From people who hear some talk or read something I write or listen to a podcast or read an essay on my blog or get hold of a book of mine or something, and they say, I never thought about it this way. It makes perfect sense. So my view is let's get 10% of the population, we can change the world.
Okay, I think we have time for one more related question. I think this really helps us.
I'm happy to answer questions all day long. I have endless energy.
You shouldn't say that when you don't know what the question is, because the question is actually this. Don't tomatoes and salad also have the same value as animals and humans? Because I'm actually thinking about they don't want to be treated as resources either. We do that. But when I'm listening to you and you talk, I was sitting out looking at the window, looking at the trees outside here. We don't know if the trees have souls. We don't know about the trees today. As we talked about animals before, they didn't have souls, they didn't have emotions. We don't know if each tomato has a soul. We don't know if tomato plants have feelings. So what is the difference between killing a tomato and killing an animal?
Well, I'm assuming
I'm
serious.
Absolutely serious.
I'll be happy to answer.
We're living. The whole point is that they are living. And you don't want us to kill something, but they are living. The tomato plant is living.
So it's alive. It's not
It
sentient.
doesn't.
Plants aren't sentient. Okay, there is no reason to believe plants are sentient. As a matter of fact, even people who talk about plant ethics, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, but there have been 2 books recently that have come out, one by Michael Marder and one by a guy named Dan Chimowitz. And in neither of those books do the authors maintain that plants are sentient, have any kind of mind, or can suffer. Plants cannot suffer. They have no nervous system. They have no benzodiazepine receptors. They are alive, but they react. They do not respond. So, now you say, well, how do we know that, they might? And the answer is, how do I know that my mouse isn't going to get up and walk away? It's not logically impossible, although I don't think it's very likely. So, do I think that plants are sentient? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, there is absolutely no evidence for plant sentience. Not any evidence whatsoever. So to say that the tomato plant wants to live is, in my mind, nonsense. I don't even understand what that means. I understand what I mean when you say my dog wants to live. I understand that. My dog has some sort of mind. It's different from my mind because my dog doesn't use symbolic communication, but my dog prefers or desires or wants to continue to live in the way that she thinks about those issues, however that is, and I'm not sure exactly how it is, but it's clear to me that she does. As a matter of fact, it's impossible to describe or understand her behavior without imputing those sorts of cognitive states to her, or equivalents of those cognitive states to her. Whereas to talk about a plant wanting to live, I don't even know what that means. There is no one there. There is no mind of any sort which prefers or desires or wants. So, does a plant react? And the answer is yes. If I put an electrical impulse through a wire, a bell will go off. But that doesn't mean that, there's any sort of cognition there of any sort whatsoever. So, I just don't, but having said that, let me just sort of get to the bottom line, which is even if plants are sentient, which I think is nonsense, but even if it were the case, we'd still be obligated to be vegans because the bottom line is every time you eat meat, you're eating many times the weight of that meat in terms of plants. So when you sit down and eat your steak, you're eating about 16 pounds of plants. So if you believe that plants are sentient, which I do not, which I think is complete nonsense, but if you believe that, then you're still obligated to be a vegan because when you eat that steak, you're eating 16 pounds of the plants that you think are sentient.
But then we should refer to Buddhism, because in Buddhism they respect everything that's living. So please don't do that then. Then it's okay.
Wait. But Buddhists drink milk. I know lots of Buddhists who eat meat and things like that. And I mean, the idea that if you respect everything, you certainly are not eating sentient beings because well, anyway, those are spiritual beliefs. I'm not a priest.
Okay, I think we have to conclude this session now. So, thank you, Professor Francione, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Very much. And thanks to both of our speakers for excellent talks. And let's give them a big applause.
Everybody do me one simple favor. When you leave that room, it's lunchtime there now. What is it? 1:30 almost, right?
It is lunchtime, yes.
Okay, all right. You're about to leave to go and eat.
Yes.
Just do me a favor. Think before you put a piece of meat or drink milk or eat another animal product. Think, is that morally right? And if you can't come up with a good reason, maybe it's because it's not, and maybe you should think about going vegan. Peace. Thank you very much for having me.
Professor Francione, this is a vegan conference.
Oh, excellent. Wonderful.